Before we get into this podcast, we just want to take a moment to let you know that there's a lot more previous as well as new content in addition to what you're hearing. Your best resource is the Insight Myanmar homepage, which can be found online at insightmyanmar.org. That's one word, Insight Myanmar, INSIGHTMYANMAR.org. We also have Facebook and Instagram pages of the same name, and we update those regularly. Here you can find background information, text and video, highlights of past shows, and previews of upcoming ones. Take a look later, because for now, sit back and enjoy what follows.
If we are complacent and don't do really aggressive containment and mitigation, the number could go way up, many, many millions.
To be isolating patients, emphasizing social distancing.
Wuhan, China confirmed the coronavirus outbreak is now a pandemic.
That COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
In Italy, one of the worst affected countries, the pace
and
of
business supply chains are being disrupted around the globe. This combination of people being unable to work, businesses being unable to
It's confirmed the coronavirus outbreak is now a pandemic.
Change for sure. It's a bit
we will realize
see an opportunity in this situation.
Please make your compassion
whatever
and loving kindness
karma
to the
that is
people.
good you have done
we are all looking out for each other.
Due to COVID-19, the meditators become more conscious.
They can certainly use this time to grow in Dhamma.
Kick out your negative minds.
People can become closer to each other.
Please send in metta to all over the world, all over the universe.
See a
change for sure.
Practice and let's work hard more and more for sending loving kindness.
People can learn how to help each other, how to love, seeing new horizons of life.
We do see some positive aspects of this corona crisis in the world. We see that in a sense that brings people also closer together. People getting closer together and watching out for each other. We have more time for our families, for the community, and time to meditate.
Please make your compassion and loving kindness.
It was kind of actually very warm and very, very kind of them. Stabilize the heart. This reminder of this uncertainty of life, where we don't know. See what we can do and what we cannot do. What we can accomplish and what we cannot.
Remember peace in the face of suffering.
This is a very different kind of show than any previous episode we've ever brought you on the Insight Myanmar podcast. Regular listeners may remember that a few months ago, we interrupted our usual run of sit-down interviews to produce a special series on the spread of the coronavirus in Myanmar. In these episodes, we checked in with how monastics and practitioners were responding to the pandemic, and highlighted the voices of meditators dealing with the world shutting down. As we were working to respond to the relevancy of that moment, itself no easy task for a skeleton crew volunteer team, another historic moment engulfed the United States and resonated with people around the world: the Black Lives Matter's protests over the killing of George Floyd. To back up for a moment and share some personal background, since the start of my endeavor to share stories of Buddhist meditation and culture, my guiding principle has fallen into a general category that I've tended to call Burma Dhamma. Indeed, this was the name of my first blog and Facebook page, and from documentaries to books, pilgrimages to presentations, and now this very podcast, my work has always been located somewhere within this broad range. But as the social justice movement developed, I felt a strong desire to step outside those parameters and explore the intersection between race and Dhamma, hoping to contribute positively to the nation's ongoing conversation. Getting technical, the design of this series template was largely influenced by the recent COVID-19 episodes we'd been working on. In other words, just as we asked a number of meditators variations on the question, How does your Dhamma practice help to inform your views and experience during this pandemic? I thought we'd ask a number of Black meditators variations on a similar question, regarding how their commitment to Dhamma has shaped their views on the unfolding protests, their personal experiences with racism, and systematic injustice in general. But as the work got underway, I soon realized how much greater this moment would be for us. Much of this inner reformulation was influenced by the depth of conversation flowing between my co-host, Zach Hessler, and Aishah Shahidah Simmons, an African-American meditator who I had met some time ago at Damodara in Massachusetts and then Dhammagiri in India, both Vipassana centers in the tradition of SN Goenka. I had invited her to help shape our content on the series, and she enthusiastically came aboard as a co-collaborator. Communicating by WhatsApp voice messages, the hours logged between the three of us on a single day were at times equivalent to binge-watching a full season of a new Netflix show. Through these talks, it became apparent that the work was not just outer in terms of the content we were bringing, but also inner in terms of the honest reflection that needs to be done within. And this is a common refrain you'll hear from our guests today, who all affirm that what is most needed now is not only rapid action or legal changes, but rather hard conversations across communities in conjunction with the sometimes painful work of inner contemplation. In any case, as my conversations with Aishah and Zach continued, not only did I have a better understanding of some of the areas I hoped this series could explore, but I also came to examine my own role in the conversation. As it developed further, I began to face some real trepidation if I was up to this task of venturing so far beyond those familiar constructs of Burma Dhamma. Living outside America for as long as I have, I'm not so in tune either with current race relations or the state of American Buddhism, and I feared that a well-intended effort could hit pothole after pothole of naivete, misunderstanding, and potential missteps. And while I have my own personal history as a minority facing discrimination and prejudice in America, experiencing anti-Semitism has been a part of my own lifelong journey. I've not been impacted by racism, and so I tread carefully and humbly with what follows. A second shift in my thinking came as I heard several guests, both in this as well as upcoming episodes in the series, describing ways they felt stunted or blocked by meditation organizations led largely by white Americans. Throughout years of not being seen, except that is when the organization happened to be in need of a token meditation teacher of color to showcase, concerns and suggestions of African American meditators and teachers were consistently ignored. And while the context where these stories took place were Vipassana centers and mindfulness retreats, their stories were eerily familiar to many of those big organizations now under scrutiny, from media companies to major corporations to professional sports leagues. On reflection, however, it's not surprising that American mindfulness and Vipassana organizations manifest some of the same unexamined biases and privileges as society at large, a point which the interviewees on this show make several times in the episode that follows. The United States has been witnessing an explosion of bravery by individuals speaking truth to power, standing up against racism and for social justice, and within many different social and economic institutions, from well-known sports franchises to giant corporations. While these acts may at times be confrontational and even put an individual job security in jeopardy, they highlight uncomfortable and too long ignored truths that society must finally face, both individually and collectively. The nature of those challenges to power and to the status quo was at times uncomfortable. Heck, the nature of any confrontation is by definition uncomfortable. But mostly they were offered in the spirit of positive change to push the needle towards initiating, at long last, an honest and open dialogue about what has been avoided or unseen for far too many years. In the same spirit, even if some of the words that follow may provoke discomfort or unease, I hope that this episode can be a platform for bringing a similar sort of conversation about entrenched practices, protocols, and attitudes within the Vipassana and mindfulness communities. The guests you are about to hear from all eagerly agreed to speak on this episode, willing to share openly about a sensitive topic that has taken them a lifetime of difficult inner work to come to grips with and learn how to respond with compassion. Because how can you really make sense of society's systematic abuse and oppression just because of the color of your skin? These speakers were hit with a blunt edge of racism early in childhood, in one case coming to grips with the overt prohibition that their family was not allowed into an amusement park, and in another case, it being assumed that he didn't belong in an advanced math class he qualified for. And these discriminatory experiences have continued on in both explicit and implicit ways throughout their lives, including into their involvement with spiritual communities at the hands of white meditators, including Dhamma teachers, as you will hear in detail in the interviews that follow. A core message of our speakers is that both the beneficiaries of privilege, as well as those who feel the sting of discrimination, need to face the discomfort of this unjust system. BIPOC, meaning Black and Indigenous people of color, are the recipients of this discomfort every day, whether they like it or not, while people of privilege need to start examining their own role in perpetuating it. Using the profound tools of meditation, both sides can find the courage to look inside at their own wounds. The speakers all strongly condemn what one refers to as spiritual bypass. The term refers to the avoidance of certain uncomfortable realities by assuming that because one has a deep spiritual practice, there is no need to deal directly with worldly matters, such as challenging emotions, difficult personal relationships, or social injustices, since one's meditation practice will automatically take care of it at some point. But the meditators you'll hear from assert that this thinking is dishonest and counterproductive, and believe that honestly confronting these issues both internally and externally will help lead to what may be some difficult conversations, but can ultimately lead to lasting positive change. For all the commonalities that run through this episode's talks, the individual experience also reveals divergences. For example, the speakers question whether Dhamma should spread organically into Black communities, or rather through targeted efforts. And the guests also discuss what kind of personal engagement in the current BLM movement is most relevant in their experience as meditators. Anyway, those are just some of the important and thought-provoking issues the first three speakers discuss in this first episode of our ongoing series exploring race, social justice, and Dhamma practice. The three guests you're about to hear from certainly give us a good start, and we hope everyone will listen to their powerful words with an open heart and mind. I'll bow out now so you can hear from them directly. First up, we hear from Victoria Robertson. She was the first Black American appointed senior assistant teacher under SN Goenka. Please note that in her talk, she makes reference to a 2003 book by Ian Hetherington called Realizing Change, Vipassana Meditation in Action, for which she was asked to write an essay titled Colors.
I'm from Roanoke, Virginia, and my family's from there as well. Eventually, I moved to New York, and then I found out about Vipassana under SN Goenka on one of my jobs, and this was in the early 90s. 1993, like December of 1993 in Massachusetts, Shelburne Falls. Well, the course was really extremely hard. My first Vipassana course, I think midway through, I thought to myself, I'm just going to do everything correctly. I'm going to follow all the rules, all the timings, all that, because I'm never coming back again. So I'll try to maximize on this course if possible. But towards the end of the course, I started understanding things a little bit better. And I think what really, really changed my perspective was the lunches. When lunchtime would come around, I would hear, and we knew that people were serving us, and they were volunteers. And about maybe 4th, 5th, 6th day or something, I said, wow, people are volunteering just to do this for us, cooking meals and keeping the space clean and all of that. And I was just amazed. I never heard of anything like that for a full 10-day course with no charge. I mean, you would, of course, leave a donation, but basically it was anything that you wanted to leave, yes, or you could afford to leave. So when I realized about serving, I come from a service-oriented family in a sense that my father he's still alive. He's always community-minded person. And both my parents were school teachers. Their parents before them were school teachers, and their parents before them. So we always were, serving people. So the next course that I did, I served. I was looking forward to that because I wanted to, pay it forward to the next students coming. So I sat and served. And prior to that, I met a man in my area. I lived in Harlem at the time. And he introduced me to the I Ching. It's a Chinese-based teaching. And so from that teaching, I wanted to learn meditation. So I went all around to all the meditation places. Now, I'm jumping a little. I'm going back before I took my first Vipassana course, or I heard about Vipassana. I just needed a meditation technique so I could learn to focus and also probably not think of things so superficially, to go a little bit beneath the surface. And as I kept taking them, coming back to having taken a few Vipassana courses, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought I said, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. You know, following the Eightfold Noble Path, all of this, everything was new to me. So just considering everything about your life, reconsidering, does that belong to you? You know, if you see a safety pin somewhere, you just pick it up, or a paper clip, or a fruit tree that's in someone else's yard, but you want to pluck the fruit, and does that belong to you? You know, seems like this should be obvious. No, it doesn't. But, you know, in life, you just take certain liberties and those type of things. Or is that a good thing to say? Would that be helpful to a certain degree? I just started noticing different things that I became more aware and conscious of my surroundings. I think my first understanding, a deeper understanding of racism was when I was 8 years old. I saw on TV that there were amusement parks in our area. And I didn't notice when they showed the little kids on whatever ride it was, that they were all white. I didn't really think about that. And then that commercial will come on TV, and I would say, like to my mom or dad, that I want to go. And I remember them not saying anything. And then I was thinking, well, maybe they just didn't hear me, or maybe they were, I guess, as in a kid's mind, preoccupied thinking about something else. So the commercial came on again, and I said the same thing again. And maybe this happened 2 or 3 times. And finally, they told me that, I guess we were called Negroes, that we weren't allowed to go to those amusement parks. And I thought seriously that they were kidding. I was like, no, you must be kidding. You know, they were like, no, we're not kidding. And I was sort of like, how can that be possible? It's on TV. And they were saying, well, this is the way it is. And I said, why would that happen? And they said, you know, well, it's ignorance. And so, well, what type of ignorance what, you know, as far as a little kid could say. Then I slowly saw that my parents had no control over this. So I figured if they don't have any control, well, I can't look to them to do anything, you know, help me or what. I mean, it was just an understanding that you started seeing that things were not probably going to go well in your life if this were the case. And then, okay, you know, you just see the town or city that we grew up in, there was a separation, you know, whites on one side, blacks on the other side. And there were conflicts, things that were uneasy. I don't think anything directly happened to me personally, but I was affected. You're always affected by racism as a black person in some form or fashion. Our parents tried very hard to protect us against that, meaning that we had our own activities, our own lifestyle, and that type of thing. But, of course, there was a limitation to everything. I mean, everything. In a sense, as long as you stayed in your own space, I think it was okay. It was okay. But, you know, of course, when there was desegregation of schools, it seemed like we always had to move to the other school. Integration didn't work. It only worked in one direction. It didn't work in both directions. And I think some of our civil rights leaders realized that later and felt very sad that they had pushed for integration. But what else to do? You know, seemingly, that's all we really knew. But I knew going to college, going different places. I went to a predominantly white college, very uncomfortable. Not a happy time in my life. And I think it was something my parents wanted me to do because they thought that college was so great or something. And so, I don't know, you just live with it in a sense. But I knew that it was something, it was a glitch inside of me. And once I started understanding vipassana, the technique, that meditation was good for you, I started addressing some of the issues that I thought were causing me misery. And so I remember one particular course that I took was a 20-day course, And I think maybe I had an incident. Racism comes up on jobs. There was so much discrimination. When you're not treated fairly, or you're not able to make the same amount of money as, your counterpart who happened to be white, or just not considered for a certain advancement when you've been there for a period of time. So I took this 20-day course, and I think I went into the course with the intention of trying to understand what was going on. Why did white people have these issues with us when we really didn't do anything to them? And then I think when I came out, I had an answer. Now, this answer was simplistic, but it satisfied me at the time. And the answer I had was, well, when you're miserable yourself, you don't keep your misery to yourself, you spread it to others. So then I felt some empathy for white people. I said, well, they must be miserable. That's why they do it. So that satisfied me for a little while. As a Black person, and a Black person from my type of background, my father ran for public office when, I was a teenager. We were always in white spaces for some time. It was uncomfortable, but I was accustomed to it. And so unless it was just downright unfair, grossly unfair, I could deal with it, especially if I knew I came for a purpose. And sometimes I think that saved me with the meditation, meaning I didn't turn it into a fellowship or join the club, a meditation club, so to speak. I came there to seriously learn meditation. So I followed all the rules, regulations, and timetables. I served a lot, so I met a lot of friends. Now, you can have white friends. I've had white friends for many times, for as long as I could remember as a young adult. But that doesn't mean you go home with them. That doesn't mean you really learn their parents or vacation with them. You go there for a purpose, and you accomplish that purpose, if that's what you want to do. So no, I didn't go there for social reasons. And I think that helped me. And when I took my first Vipassana course, I was 38 already. So I was deadly serious. And, a 10-day course is not a joke. I mean, it's really hard. And you're taking time away from, earning money and this type of thing. So I was very serious. I didn't get into those thoughts. But, of course, things will come up about racism. But I didn't expect them to solve that problem for me. When I went to my courses, I realized the teachers they couldn't address that. I learned the technique. I was so friendly and accommodating. Of course, people were very nice, but also it gave me an opportunity to observe them. And I grew up in a very professional family, meaning we took our jobs, whatever they were, seriously. And I saw that they would not have the answer. They lived in a whole total world, and they weren't trying to address the African American problem or anything like that. So, I just did what I needed to do for myself. But coming back again, I was so friendly, all this. So, of course, they asked me to come and serve. But I had to make a decision. I said, do you want to, serve, be friendly with these people, or do you really want to learn, go deeper with your meditation? So they asked me to serve long term, like in Massachusetts or somewhere in the United States. I knew for myself that I wouldn't get much out of it, meaning, I don't know. It would be hard to just know why I felt that way. I don't want to judge anyone, but I just knew it. So I said, okay, I think I'll go and serve a long time in India. At least I would get to meet S.N. Goenka, and I can see what his volition is, and I can tell other Black people, in a sense, if they would like to take these courses. I can tell them that I met the person who started it, as opposed to white people who are in charge of centers in the U.S. That was great. I mean, but I think also it was great because I couldn't speak the language, so I didn't get involved in any of the daily things that can happen when groups of people gather together. You know, I would just do my practice and serve, do what they told me to do. And so in that way, and then we would see Goenka G. You could go see him anytime you wanted, just about when he was on campus. And it was very comforting. And I think I saw my father in him. And I saw how his family helped him when we did the same thing with my father. So I took the practice very seriously during those times and felt very grateful that I had that opportunity. Now, were some of the teachers there in India prejudiced against African Americans? Yes, very much so. But I don't know, maybe because they were prejudiced secondhand, meaning they learned this from Westerners, or maybe, you know, and I wasn't African, maybe because Africans go there. But, you know, I just didn't feel the type of sting that I would feel here in the United States. In Dhammagiri, well, I realized that was true ignorance. If they, you know, what they knew about African Americans, they did not know. And maybe they have a prejudice, well, I won't say maybe they have a prejudice against dark skin, you know, but I realized that they didn't know. In America, I felt like white Americans knew what they were doing. I mean, although unconscious, meaning they hadn't realized the truth within themselves, but we had a history. That's the difference. I didn't have a history with Indians. I have a history with white Americans. Well, the first time I went for 6 months. And then right after that, I came home to make some money to go back, and I was there for about a year. And then I would come back and forth for like yatras or special occasions. And I was appointed an AT to be an assistant teacher in 2002 or so. So in 2009, they dedicated it's a place called Dhammapatana. It's a global pagoda near Mumbai. And so they were having world leaders, everyone coming, leaders in India. And that was in 2000, and they were planning it in 2008. That was the year that Obama won. So for the first time, the Indians now understood what an African American was. So the Indians at Dhammagiri anyway, you know. And so someone on the committee said, do we have any African American ATs? Of course, I was the only one at that time. And so they asked me to come to that inauguration of this pagoda. And it was kind of sad because, you know, you have over 3,000 people there, and maybe 4 or 5 black people. Well, black Americans. Well, they were black people from different parts of the world. What happened was they invited me to come. I wasn't going to come because I had gone so many times, maybe 10 times before. And I was like, well, you know, to be the token AT, I'm not sure if I want to do that. But I think they might have already anticipated that. So they said they would pay my way. You know? So, you know, when they said they would pay my way, I was like, you know, I called my father. I said, should I do this? You know, I mean, it's really short notice. Usually, you know, most of the time I prepare to go to India, you know, 3 or 4 months ahead of time. And I said, should I pay my own way or should I, you know, let them pay my way? He said, I think you should let them pay your way. You know, they want you to come. So I went. And then after that, one of the ATs mentioned to me, she was going to be an AT. I think they were preparing her to be an AT. And she's African from Kenya, but had lived in England for many years. And she proposed, we had been speaking about it for a little while, emailing, and she came up with a title because people of color just didn't sound like that was a Vipassana way of doing things. So she came up with the title African Heritage. So that would mean people of African descent from all over the world. So I arranged it on this end because my father had a camp in Virginia, founded it through JC organization for people with mental and emotional challenges, physical challenges. But in the off season, people rented the camp. So for about 10 years or so, we put on 10-day courses there twice a year. So the people who lived in the area who happened to do vipassana, we all set that course up in around 2002. So I knew how to set up courses, and I knew how to get a registration person. So I asked a few of the meditators if they would help me out. Would they be open to being involved in a project like this? And I used to have a lot of group sittings at my home, so I knew a lot of meditators. So we set this course up remotely, and first we had to get permission from Goenka. I wrote a long letter to him and all of this, and he said yes. So we set it up, and that took place. So that took place in the thoughts that perhaps we could have those courses here in America too, at certain centers. And that would attract more Black people. That would be a way of conducting outreach by holding these courses, or maybe one course a year. We got a lot of pushback, especially from Americans, that wasn't necessary. We didn't need that. I was very surprised. And I didn't really know where that was coming from. I guess I didn't want to know where it was coming from. But the course was held and it was successful. We were not allowed to have the courses here in America. It was coming from all the ATs here in America. The excuses were, we don't need that. That would cause a separation. That would bring racism out more. These are the typical excuses that we would use before in any situation that involved race. I mean, centers are no different from, our own systems. Systemic racism is a part of our country. So I would imagine it made them uncomfortable. They said that it was against Dhamma. I think that that's what happens in our meditation groups, because you run away from what's uncomfortable a lot of times. I didn't start my path until I was 38, so I have been uncomfortable with, race for my entire life. And this was something that I said, if there's a truth, a real truth, well, I must come out of this if it's possible. And, it's so interesting. The way I came out of it was through it. Me promoting African Heritage Course, I already knew once you start promoting something that's, as a Black person, the lone Black person, your chances of succeeding are probably not very high, and you get singled out, and anything can happen after that. And it did. But it was also my own salvation, because I didn't give up meditating. It was too much a part of me. Well, I felt like I was serving. I was an AT for 7 years. That meant I served a lot of people, right? I mean, I would do sometimes I would even serve 5 courses a year, or the minimum was 3. And I went to Israel. I went to different countries serving even. So that meant I hardly ever served African Americans, maybe 1 or 2 if they showed up in the courses. And every time you sit down with Goenka, he would always say, you must spread Dhamma to your community voice. And he said it to everyone. It wasn't particular. So that's all I thought I was doing. And I came up with an idea. The American community had an idea. They had I don't know if you remember this or you have heard of it, but there was a movie or a film that came out. It was called Dhamma Brothers. And it showed incarcerated men, Black men predominantly, taking the Vipassana course. And the assistant teacher and the male server they were white, and so people put up flyers everywhere. And I said, this is not a good idea, because what you're saying, what people will see, what other white people will see, is that, you're serving Black criminals. They're not going to see. I mean, the rare person, maybe every 100th person, will see that you're serving. Oh, that's nice. It's great. It's very beneficial for everyone. But I said it's not going to be seen that way. And I said, if you think that's going to attract African Americans, it will not. Because first of all, it makes it seem the African American community are all incarcerated or something. And all Black Americans don't see themselves that way. And they thought it was comparable to doing vipassana. And I said, well, I don't think it's really like that. But they wouldn't listen to me. I think I was there as a token, and that was it. They didn't think any deeper than that. And these people I really like, I mean, in a sense, it makes me almost feel uncomfortable talking about it because I don't think they consciously knew that's what they were doing. We were all at Dhamagiri at that time. And he was an assistant teacher. I don't know, where he is or if he's still alive or anything. He was going to write a book on realizing change from having taken vipassana. But I was the only Black person there. So that was who I was. I was realizing change in a sense that I stopped assuming that white people knew what they were doing, that they were rude. For the first time, I was able to understand just unconscious behavior. I had studied a little bit of psychology, but not that much. But what unconscious, and I can see from my unconsciousness what I've done. So I realized they were doing the same thing. It didn't bring me any that closer, but I saw them more human. And then we have a long way to go. And that I could stop blaming myself for whatever would happen, because as they were afraid that at that particular time, I mean, things have changed so rapidly, since everything that's taken place with George Floyd and all that. I don't think I've ever heard white people call themselves white people even, and that this should stop and why is this happening? And yes, they have white privilege. Before that was not something you would talk about at all. So I think that Ian just thought, oh, wow, he didn't realize that probably what I was going to write was going to be that strong, but he still wanted to place it in the book. And he asked me at the time, did I want it to be another name? And I said, no, I don't want it to be another name, but it's your book. I mean, I'm kind of liberal. I'm not trying to win any gold stars. I just want to come out of my misery, so that was that. I thought honesty was the best policy. The content of my essay was how I felt about being Black in America. And I just said that, most Black people don't like white people. Why? Basically, I'm paraphrasing what I'm saying, but what I wrote, why? Because they are not likable. They keep everything for themselves, and then whatever's left over you may have. But it's there, you learn agape love. And I'm really paraphrasing because I don't have the book in front of me. But basically, but you're in misery because you are having these reactions to racism for being a second-class citizen, treated like a second-class. And when I first heard Goenka talk about reactions as opposed to response, I sat up and I realized I could respond as opposed to reacting, which was harmful to me. I really didn't care. I didn't, like this his book, that's what he wanted to do. I mean, the teachers, the community is very complicated. I mean, it was nicer when I was a student, as opposed to it would seem complicated to me. Maybe because I was always by myself, the only Black person. But it just didn't seem like it was a free flow, like you could be that honest. So I didn't know whatever his reasons were, it just didn't matter. I wrote it. Whatever anybody got out of it, I even forgot about it, tell you the truth, until now. The impression or the feeling was that, maybe it was very uncomfortable. So instead of a person saying, well, this is uncomfortable because this is something that I'm not dealing with, it would be like, oh, this is uncomfortable and Victoria has a problem, which several people would say that to me when I would bring up race, some ATs, and they were like, you're going to be labeled a racist. And I thought that was funny, but kind of laughable, but I really realized I couldn't articulate. If they could think like that, well, how would I explain anything to them? It was just pointless. Something, my intuition telling me a big change was going to happen. Some big change was going to happen. And we have the COVID-19. I was surprised that we would have this type of time off. And I think this is the crux of it all. Why the Black Lives Movement could show up again even during this time, and because of the downtime that we all have experienced because of COVID-19. People didn't have anywhere else to put their attention. One thing about, if we go back to racism and in my experience in life, I realized at a certain point that, the white community is very pushed to accomplish. It's like about accomplishing everything. And they have a hierarchy in their own communities about, where they're going to live and education and all that. And so they're always very busy. Even I realized with the meditation centers, it's not like people have a lot of energy to develop inwardly because they're always building new centers. They're very busy. So if you're very busy, you don't have a lot of time to contemplate what's happening and how it affects others. So COVID-19, to me, everyone was in this together, all over the world. And then George Floyd is killed in the manner that he's killed, and we all have cell phones. So that picture there was taken in very deeply. Prior to that, I think it would have just been, okay, if everyone was busy trying to get to work, trying to do all the things, hit those deadlines and do what they need to do, it would have just been another, bad thing that happens, and that, we would keep moving on. And they would keep happening. But I can see that everyone had to take a time out, a pause. COVID-19 caused us to pause against our will. But meditation supposed to lead you to go beyond mind and matter. Okay? Ultimately. I didn't do meditation to calm myself down. I don't think I would have lasted very long trying to do that. The goal is to go beyond mind and matter. If you're very busy, you can't do that. But I can see that in our societies of the world, that we haven't gone beyond mind and matter. So it's always this fight or control or dominance or revenge or justice, no peace. All of that. We will always be fighting for something because we don't know who we are, truly are. And, once I asked Goenka Ji about racism, and he said, this thing of superiority and inferiority must go. But laws cannot change people's hearts. Only Dhamma can do that. Because if laws could change, it would have happened a long time ago, correct? So it hasn't changed. I don't think it will ever change. We will evolve a little bit here, a little bit there, but until we are evolved as human beings, and which is a huge task, to see that, you are not your body. You're not your material body. You are something else that we all have in common. But this has to be explored. Well, I think these, spiritual organizations say, let me just stick with Vipassana since I know that they have to have courses that are close to an inner city, that people can get to by public transportation, that they can learn about meditation, they can find out about, even if they only take 1 or 2 courses. It'll get you closer to understanding quiet and what peace is, and also serving others. Say, for instance, if there were, which I told the leaders, they call themselves leaders now, as opposed to chariots a few years back, or maybe they are interchangeable, the words, I'm not sure, but that, if there's a course where it's mostly Black people are attending, okay, and white people are serving, well, things are going to come up, probably, because they came up for me when I was serving all white folks, so it'll come up. But you can go and sit with that 3 times a day. And then you will understand that there is racism, that I do hold biases. I mean, look, Black people already know that they don't like white people. Okay, they already know that they have issues in some ways concerning, social injustice. But I'm not certain if a lot of white people until now have considered themselves having biases or being even racist. You have to become aware of it. But some people, and like the Vipassana organization, think that, you just continue, it's this continuous just working on yourself. And if you continue to work on yourself, well, you will shine light as you go out. But you always go out in your same spaces, So I see that there's still separation. We work together as Black and white in America, but we mostly don't live together. So there's a separation. I was trying to tell them, yes, try to have a course where people, like I said, can use public transportation. It doesn't have to be in the woods somewhere. You don't have to have it be quiet. I mean, like quiet. You can hardly hear a twig, break. That's not necessary. We're not running away from sounds and moderate disturbances. We're trying to meet them and just be with that. Be with the agitation. Be with the being uncomfortable. And see that you don't have to run away, perhaps. You might have to meet with it over and over. But you would definitely, that's growth. By the way, I'm not with the organization anymore. So I have a Vipassana background. I did Vipassana, I practiced it for 18 years. So, once that stopped, I didn't have the urge to go out and find another group. I learned the technique. I wanted to go deeper in the technique. So that was like nearly 10 years ago. So I just continued my practice in my daily life. 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening. I felt like I would make progress. Before I walked away from it, I checked myself. And if I thought that I needed to still be with them, under that regiment, I would have stayed. But I didn't, because I realized that they weren't hearing me. They didn't see me. We weren't on the same page. And that was particularly painful. But it wasn't a pain that I wasn't familiar with. And the practice, the whole thing is about the practice. The practice kept me sane. The practice, I've done it incorrectly too, in my career of practicing, which is like 27 years. So, of course, you've done things incorrectly. But I just trusted that I've done all that I could do. And I can't do no more. I mean, I can't get any better than this or worse than this. I mean, they didn't throw me out of the organization. I could have come back, but I was like, when do you ever know if the practice works for you or not? If you go back all the time, and you need approval all the time. I don't know. So I said, let me try this. And if I completely fail, meaning let me try, just meditate on my own, just realize I don't have a group, go to my job, come back. It was a big change. It took a few years to even come down from the reference, my reference point would be the vipassana, because, being an AT, you have to pour so much of your own energy into that life. So I said, let me check it out. I can see if I fall totally apart, can't handle myself, I don't have that kind of pride. I would definitely go back. But let me grapple with it. Let me try. And then one day when I walked on the beach, because I live near a beach, and I was walking on the boardwalk, and I was so unsettled after what happened and the way I was spoken to, et cetera, et cetera. All I knew was to keep coming back to my breath. I had a job, so my respite was to be at the job. But when I was alone, or when I was just working on my own, or coming home, or going to work, or before sleep, I would keep coming back to my breath to keep my sanity. And so one time I was walking on the boardwalk, and I kept coming back to my breath. And for one instant, when I came back, because when I would come back to my breath, my mind would snatch back, go right back to my thoughts. And then this one instant, it didn't. And I suddenly realized, oh, you were never an assistant teacher, just like you were never a cheerleader. That's not who you are. You are just beyond mind and matter. Which I didn't say those words at that time. I mean, it was just because there was no reference point. I didn't come back to a thought process or a stream of consciousness thing for some moments. And from there, I was able to practice in a different way. But it's a different way, because it's a different perspective, I guess. And, to this day, that's been my routine. That's what I do. And, I have to, cut out a whole lot of other things in my life that, would take my attention away. But that's been okay, because then that prepared me even for the COVID, believe it or not, because I live alone. I live in a little community separated from other communities because of the beach and everything. And I just treated this whole COVID thing like I've taken 60-day courses, a long course, like I was on a course. And if a day or two I only did meditation, didn't hardly eat, or didn't clean up well, that was okay. And I mean, it was hard because a couple of the people on my job, they were sick with COVID. They recovered. But I knew that only meditation would get me through it.
As a follow-up to Victoria's interview, the following is a very short clip of an interesting recollection she has about her essay, Colors. But before that, I wanted to take a moment to share some relevant personal background. As a young meditator, I read her essay, which for me stood out from all the other essays appearing in the book. So when we began this series, I wanted to seek out its author, although I had no idea that she was forced to use a pseudonym, as you heard. But now, here is Victoria's clip.
And then you kind of figured it was me. That's really wild. As soon as I got off, I read your note. I have a number of books on my, on my bookshelves. My eye went directly to that book. Let me see where that book is. And my eye went directly there. So then I knew that. I said, well, yeah, you have to do this. It's a good thing to do. When I reread it, and again, it's hard to remember. It's hard for me to remember a lot of things now, but that were earlier in my practice. But the word hate was in there several times. I was like, that's strong.
Next, we check in with Joshua B. Alafia, a Taoist and Insight meditation teacher, as well as an author and film director. He leads Mindfulness Mondays, Tao Tuesdays sessions on Zoom. Please refer to the links in this episode description for details. You can also visit his website, www.joshuabalafia.com. That's JOSHUABEEALAFIA.com.
I was born in Boston. Both my parents were into meditation, so it was something I was exposed to really young. I have a perhaps unique or semi-unique upbringing in that both my parents were into different gurus. My father was into Meher Baba, and my mother, when I was little, was into Swami Muktananda. So I grew up with those influences. I moved to Texas at a young age, and later went to New Jersey for high school. So I really spent a lot of my youth bouncing around and being the new kid. And I think that also kind of brought me into an introspective place really young. So it was kind of a natural progression as I started meditating as a teenager, something I kind of rebelled against. And then later, like towards the end of my high school, I started meditating, and I've been doing it ever since. My first exposure really was from my mother, and she gave me first a mantra that she had received in TM. It was Ing, and I didn't respond well to her. I just didn't like repeating Ing, 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 Ing over and over, and so she gave me Soham from the Swami Muktananda's tradition, and that really resonated with me. So I guess my first exposure was like from like a Vedic style. And then I kind of hit the ground running. My mother also gave me this book called Urban Shamanism that was about Hawaiian shamanism, and it had some meditation, some more visualized driven meditations. And so I started experimenting with those. And, I'm like 19 at the time. But I had really powerful experiences. And so I was hooked. And then I think it was a second wave of Tibetans started coming, Tibetan teachers. And I kind of bounced around different Tibetan teachers and then landed with Sogyal Rinpoche in the late 90s. And I was in my late 20s. And I'm skipping. I also had explored some Sufi meditation. I was into Aryeh Kaplan, and he has these beautiful books, Kabbalah and meditation and the Bible and meditation. So just like reading from books, I was exploring some of the mystical Judaism's path. So I had a lot of different tastes, a lot of different experiences. And then, Dzogchen really blew me away. Like I had never had a teacher transmit and show me empty mind the way Sogyal Rinpoche did. Then later, Namakai Norbu, also one of my great teachers. And then around 2005, I started going to New York Insight. I'd been living in New York, and Gina Sharp had been having these really popular people of color sits every Monday. The first Monday of the month, I believe it was. So I started attending those and ended up taking some classes at New York Insight. And she was just a really great teacher, a real master teacher. And at a certain point, she was like, you know what, you should apply to this teacher program. And I had a lot of resistance. I was like, I really don't see myself teaching meditation, but thank you. And she's like, no, just, apply. And, if you get in, then take it from there. And I was like, wow, okay. And it was for a scholarship too. So I applied because I did have this real desire to teach incarcerated youth because, I was an adventurous adolescent, and I, was friends with kids who we just liked getting in trouble. We didn't hurt people, but we did really stupid things like take parents' cars out and, just lots of, and even dangerous things. So I really wanted to share meditation with youth. So Gina actually linked me with the Lineage Project. I ended up getting into the teaching program, the community Dharma leaders through Spirit Rock. And went right into teaching, like immediately, working with the Lineage Project, which works with system-involved youth, system-vulnerable youth, both incarcerated and as they come out, and kids in high schools and junior highs who were just on the verge or had been somehow involved. And that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I did it for 8 years. And I started teaching in New York Insight and ended up starting a group with Sebene Selassie, who's People of Color and Allies. Started in her living room, and she has a Italian husband, so it would be weird to have like a people of color sit and be like, Federico, you have to leave. So that actually became popular and went through different phases. Sebene actually had to walk away from it because she became the executive director of New York Insight. So I just went forward with it, and we found a home at the Brooklyn Zen Center, which I thought was really beautiful. It's like a real inter-sangha experience, and they gave us 2 nights a month. And I taught there until I left in 2018. I moved to Chicago to maintain my 50-50 custody of my son, and started Southside Insight. So I've been teaching there, and I've also been teaching in the Taoist tradition. Didn't really mention that, but Taoist meditation and Taoist practice has been a huge part of my practice of the last 10 years. So, teaching from the Theravada lens, it's such intense mind-heart purification that really was something I felt like was really important to bring to the youth, as well as people who have gone through a lot of trauma, especially the people of color movement. So I've really been focused on that. Really, the Brahma Viharas being my central practice and teachings. Really, just as we confront all the wounds in our heart, I think that whenever I would bring forgiveness meditation to incarcerated folks, youth and young adults, that was always a real powerful one. I mean, some of these kids have been through really like hell realms on earth. I mean, for instance, one talked about, watching his mother turn tricks, and, his mother was an addict, and he would actually have to even sell drugs to his mother. And so his forgiveness practice was really diesel because he had to really, really stretch out to forgive. So he had gone through so much trauma. A lot of the transformation was so internal and subtle that it wasn't like, we'd have a magical class and I'd leave there feeling like, yes, I reached them. A lot of times, it was more of a struggle, and I'd really have to lean into the movement, teaching Tai Chi and Qigong for most of the time, and then a short meditation at the end. But it was times like, for instance, one student would always be reading his comic book, when I go to his group, and I'd always offer it, but he would always kind of sit back. And then finally one day, I offered, and he was like, yeah, I'll try it. And he ended up becoming one of my most engaged students. And he went through a lot of facing a lot of his wounds. And sadly, there was an incident where a staff member was speaking very disrespectful to him, and he lost his temper. And I wrote up an incident report, and we ended up getting fired from that place because of the politics, unfortunately. So there's a lot of stories that, a lot of things happened out of my direct awareness, but then later would be revealed, or towards the end. It's very hard work. for anyone who's contemplating. I strongly recommend it. And also don't think that you're going to be like a Pied Piper or something, like, you know, you're going to like just like you hold this tool that you're going to share with people and they are going to just transform before your very eyes. It's a lot more gritty than that, and a lot more subconscious, and a lot more perhaps happening on another dimension or something. It's happening really deep in the subconscious, a lot of it. And there's a lot of detox as we all go through in our practice. And just imagine kids been taken advantage of in every conceivable way, including you know, all kinds of abuse, mental, physical, sexual, and systematic abuse, being a lot of them being punished for mental illness. So yeah, it's very rewarding work, and it's really hard work. Very hard. As a Black meditator in the West, I've found it's been a rocky road in the meditation world. You know, we live in a country where we suffer from cultural narcissism. There's all these very nuanced narcissisms in our society. And so, you know, mentioning empathy, which is impossible when you have narcissistic personality disorder. Compassion is something, you know, it's like a really, it's a far road. It's a distance from where people are starting. So it's been interesting, you know. I really love how Angel Kyoto Williams presents racism as a mental illness and a personality disorder. That really rung true as I've examined it. And, you know, I could tell a whole lot of stories of both, you know, students questioning my validity as a teacher, going through all kinds of changes just with the power dynamic of having a Black man sitting above them in the teacher's seat, perhaps, to other teachers having all kinds of bizarre reactivity around sharing spaces, you know. So the meditation world reflects our mainstream society, you know. So if we're having a lot of dysfunction in our mainstream society, of course we're having it here in our meditation world. And, you know, it's beautiful time. I really think that, you know, we will call this the Great Awakening. And in the future, when we look back at this time, we're becoming aware of the sicknesses. And then slowly, I think we're starting to dress the wounds. But, you know, we still have a really far way to go. You know, it takes, when a lot of people, when there's so much anxiety, you know, it takes courage to heal. You know, it really takes courage. And when there's so much spiritual bypass coming into society, and people, you know, my colleagues are saying things like, well, I don't see color, you know, and, you know, all the typical, you know, spiritual bypass anthems. It's hard to move from that place. So until folks are really willing to undress and really examine their own sicknesses, and I'm not using sickness in the pejorative, it's an impermanent state of heart mind, one that can be healed, but it really requires a full commitment and engagement. Until that happens, we'll still, you know, spin in circles. But I feel like it's happening, you know, slowly or fast, maybe, but it feels slow. And I'm really honored to be, to any offering that I might be able to give to help that purification. I'm really honored to be engaged in it. So spiritual bypass is a rampant disorder that we're dealing with, because white privilege and able-bodied privilege and gender privilege, all of our privileges kind of become camouflaged in our spiritual practice. It now becomes a feeling of superiority as being a more evolved soul or something. And I've dealt really directly with this with students talking to me about the alienation of their practice because everyone else is so ill-evolved. And a real hindrance that we have is because many of us come to the Dharma with wounds. We take refuge in the Dharma and forget how relational this practice is really built on being. I mean, if we all were begging alms, having that interaction and that humbling, we'd be in such a different place, I think. We really would, in terms of, there wouldn't be the same kind of sequestering of our spiritual practice. And, it's hard to still move in mainstream society and be practicing something with a very ancient tradition, and it was kind of designed for another time in some ways. And many of us not willing to even embrace who Siddhartha and Yasodhara were. This is another thing that I come into a lot of dissonance with. And I am not one who's going to stand around and say that Yasodhara, Siddhartha Gautama's wife, was not a Buddha. I think it's a very primitive interpretation to just demand that she was an arahat, and that she wasn't quite a Buddha, almost, but not quite, even though she taught 500, nuns, and, was teaching, and was, when they describe her death in the suttas, it's identical to Siddhartha's, give a teaching and then leave the body. It's just like there's just so much fantasy and so much that was lost just from the misogyny, that happened when you decide to create a sector of society that is really geared towards just one gender. Of course, Buddha, is going to be just a male embodiment. If it's all men, usually that's what happens. And you can look at all the religions. All the religions are like this. I mean, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter was a prophet, but she can't be because he's supposed to be the last. Anyway, I could go, that's a whole tangent. I could go on. But as we're dealing with our spiritual bypass and, just feeling like, okay, well, we are all one, so I don't need to examine my own bias, my own racism, my own ageism, my own gender phobia, transphobia, any of my own contractions, because I am engaged in this spiritual practice of interbeing. I am just going to be in the fantasy of interbeing and not the practice of it. Part of that is just the mind. The mind is so leaning into concepts. And so we attach to concepts, and especially concepts that make us feel elevated. So we'll really cling to this concept of interbeing, but we don't experience it. And that's why this is such a shamanic practice. This is only to be experienced. It's not to be just hypothesized and, then concept hoarding. And, some of my teachers, Larry Young and Gina Sharp, talk about the decolonizing of the practice. And it's because, Western Buddhism came through conquest. It came through colonization. India, Sri Lanka, Burma, even Thailand. I mean, the Thai aren't going to say that they're colonized, but what happened was the Dharma was, as we start setting up schools in other countries, so the British Empire was doing that, and school being, the whole British system being all about memorization. And so all the lists of Buddhism became organized into lists even more so, and became this accumulating knowledge of lists instead of living the practice. And I'm not picking on Buddhism. All religions suffer from this. What if we were actually living the practice of our prophets and our sages and our Buddhas? What if we were actually living them? So few of us are willing to, actually. It can be uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable to genuinely give yourself. And compassion is not a philosophical thing. It's actually moving towards actively the ending of suffering and the causes and conditions of those suffering in yourself and others. Well, what's that look like? It looks like action. So it's really interesting. I mean, we have all these revolutionary archetypes, and all of these avatars that we love, most of them. And yet, how revolution are we? How much of the revolution are we actively doing in our own lives? How much are we reaching out to others to end their suffering? How much of our own suffering? Why is self-metta so hard? Why don't we even practice self-metta? How can we possibly give metta to someone else when you can't give it to yourself? There's just so much dysfunction in our practice and in our society. It's comic, An interesting contemplation is our own attachment to myth, our own attachment to the evolution, I guess, of the myth of a prince and a princess who became enlightened, who chose to walk away from his fortune and his palace. I'll never forget during my teacher program and community Dharma leaders, John Peacock came and gave a talk on kind of he's a great British Pali scholar, practitioner. So he was talking about how, there was no palace, there were no gates for Siddhartha and Yasodhara to be sequestered away from sickness, a monk, death. This is all just myths, and then they lived in thatch structures. And then, this is very hard for some of our folks from the subcontinent, from India, to hear. They were like, well, how are you going to come and take away our royalty? We're talking about warriors who, a more correct story, and kind of like, which I think is much more, speaking to human consciousness. It's like, and especially where we are now, these were warriors who walked away from the military caste. Yes, they were the sons and daughters chiefs in the warrior class, but there wasn't this kind of classist separation that you have with like royalty when we think of, maybe in Europe or in China or different other places. This was like, they looked like more like Maasai people or something. It was more like, this kind of warrior culture. And now we're in this place of, we are in this military culture. Hollywood is based on a military chain of command. I mean, everything, there's so much military consciousness in everything we do in the corporate world and everything. And we're just like Siddhartha and Yasodhara, we're coming into this awareness of, wow, actually, war is the most ridiculous, barbaric, primitive way to engage with one another. I mean, it's just causes so much suffering, and there's so many innocent people killed. I mean, it's just such a weak debate. I'm much more interested in, letting go of Orientalism and like our Disneyfication of, Siddhartha and Yasodhara, and we're dealing with revolutionaries. So if you really want to practice, how are you going to really engage with society in a way that is transformative? Yes, we're transforming our hearts, and we have to start there. But then let's also be aware that we have a calling. If you believe in compassion, if you really feel like that is a way of life that you're going to have for yourself and others, then you need a game plan of, okay, well, what is my service going to be here? We all have things that we can do, really simple things. Really simple. I tell students this all the time. Like sometimes, I'll give a Dharma talk and students will be like, well, what can I do? Like, what can I was like, do you know any single moms? Do their laundry for them. Get them some groceries. A single parent? Start there. Start with just people in your community. Be help. Help someone out. Do something helpful to someone. You don't know what kind of the chain of blessings that could spawn from that in terms of helping out a single overwhelmed parent who then doesn't snap at their child and say something so destructive to their child or use physical punitive punishment. That doesn't happen all of a sudden because someone helped them and they have a little more, bandwidth and patience because they didn't have to only sleep 3 hours because they were doing laundry and dishes and, trying to do their night school or whatever they're doing, The more that we can impact others, and this comes back into real interbeing, we're actually consuming society into ourselves. So naturally, if you're going to practice self-love, you're going to practice love of others. And how can you be helpful to yourself and others? So this isn't a style. This isn't just about, getting really fancy Buddhas and having a really nice altar space and going on retreats that give you this like feeling of association with the wise or something. And then like through osmosis, you're then awakening. No, it's actually, really doing the difficult task of looking at our own limitations and seeing what we can do to go beyond them. Deconditioning this heart, our misperceptions, and really seeking clarity and actively, constantly putting ourselves out there to help others. As Black Lives Matter has had this second wave, and I think a much more impactful one, as we've been under the pressure of the pandemic and people having, frankly, a lot of people just not having work responsibilities. And, it was just like really amazing when you think about it, how the youth that we were so quick to write off as being just consumed with their own, addictions to social media and their digital gadgetry, the youth came so strong. And we all can learn from this movement towards actively going toward the suffering of others and standing strong and creating alliances and, really commitment, just really coming into right effort, So what we have to offer in terms of our practice, those of us who are practicing, the activists are stressed out. This is a thing. It's like part of what happens in our fervor and as activists is we stir the pot of reactivity as well. We can really suffer from some of the othering that we're fighting against as we're, like I've watched, some activists screaming in the faces of police. The police are sitting there. What I was reading was they were feeling embarrassed because they knew that, I think a lot of them wanted to actually join the protest. Like they were kind of embarrassed of their profession. They're ashamed of being associated with a lot of mentally ill people who are murdering. You have to come into the consciousness of risking your life to be, going into a profession where you can have bodily harm. Why would you do that? And what happened to you? What happened to your inner child that now you want to prevent injustice physically with force? There's so much abuse in their eyes. If you look into the eyes of our soldiers and our police, if you can't see the wounds, I don't know what to say to you, actually. You're just not looking or you don't want to see it. But many of us don't want to see or feel each other's pain in general. So I have compassion for that. But maybe we can. And so we have this collision of the wounded. Many of us who are activists have serious wounds that we're like the police in a different way. We're not going to let that injustice keep happening. It's the same wound, just different choice. One is going through a military training to do it. The other one is hanging out with radicals who have a looser, acceptance and, it's a different way to be in the same position of defending that inner child who had trauma. So as practitioners, and what the Dharma has to teach is this way of really this radical tolerance, this radical self-healing, these radical tools of self-healing. Because a lot of me included as an activist, we neglect our wounds. We are projecting and completely consumed externally. There isn't a lot of balance. And this is in society in general. But this is a time, and even I would even venture to say, with the coronavirus, I think there's more meditation probably is happening in this country than ever before, probably, 1,000 times more. And I'm seeing all these people being called to teach. It's interesting. It's kind of like, I don't know, like a prospector or like the Old West or something. Like people are just kind of, without formal training, just putting themselves out there, just trying to help. It's coming from a place mostly, I think, of like really loving their own experience and self-healing and wanting to share it, and so this is something that I'm hoping and praying that, we can really evolve from this ordeal and share our practices, start looking inwardly, start healing our internal, and then healing the collective. That's what the Great Awakening is. And I do feel we're at the beginning of it. We're at the beginning. We're at the place, I think that when I look at my parents' generation, LSD was so effective. And then, LSD, heroin, and then crack were so effective from just wiping out the structure and the cohesion of the movement. You know, you think about Black Panthers doing a bunch of coke and then pulling out bullwhips and like whipping, using punitive measures and whipping each other. You know, the Rastas, same thing. Boatloads of cocaine coming into Jamaica and totally disrupting the movement. LSD completely, I have people in my family never the same after taking really strong LSD, even sometimes given by professors. It was just such, using drugs, such a powerful and effective way to destroy the movement. And so now we're in this time of, going beyond that, and actually there's all of this attention to health in a different way. We have a different consciousness of health and chemical dependency. And, we've seen family members destroyed by different drugs and alcohol. And I think, I don't know, I think that we're being primed for a new sense of clarity, a new embracing of clarity, and really experiencing this natural high of clarity and of releasing our own wounds. It's a rush, actually. Healing is there's a part of it that's like, as someone who used to abuse marijuana and really love the euphoria of marijuana in my 20s, there's a euphoria from self-healing, and a euphoria from being someone who's helpful in some way, I'd just like to say it's been a real honor to talk about these things. These are all issues really dear to me, these issues of how we can make the world a better place without just being sentimental about it, but actually being active and engaged and really bringing out the best in one another and really, really healing ourselves. So I'm really, really honored to be a part of the conversation.
Finally, I have a conversation with Wayne Smith, who is a professional cellist and a long-course Vipassana student in the tradition of SN Goenka. To hear some of his music, check out www.arcticmoth.com. That's ARCTICMOTH.com. As we start the interview, we should mention that for listeners hearing this, they're hearing my voice. Typically on these series, we just hear the voice of the guest. In this format and dynamic, we're having a conversation rather than just hearing from you directly. And maybe before we start, we just take a moment to share why that format was more appealing for you and what you thought was special about having a conversation dynamic instead of just getting your part of your perspective and story.
Well, I feel like having a conversation at this time, or having conversations, I should say, is really the most important thing, or one of the most important ways that we can evoke a real change and get some real perspective on this. We've all been quarantined, a worldwide quarantine for months together, many stimuli removed, a great chance to look inside, to be introspective and see where various aspects of our actions and our thinking and our lives and our, positions have brought us. We're contending with a real lack of control over our environments. And so I feel like this gives us a really wonderful chance, as a strange silver lining, to see things in a different way. And now that all these horrific events have transpired, dealing so much in this country with, blatant racism and violence and hatred and division more than anything, I thought that this might be a good time, while things are fresh and while things are raw and while we are introspective, to actually talk about this, as opposed to just solidifying our own ideas unchecked, unchallenged. That was where I was coming from with this.
Thanks for that. So let's get started off with that. And before we get into some of the more recent events that have happened and your thoughts on them. Let's go back to the beginning. If you can just give us a brief introduction to who you are, where you came from, how you were raised, and just a little bit about your background.
Well, I was raised in Westfield, New Jersey. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill, American suburb, not too far from New York City. I grew up in a Black neighborhood that was situated in a white town. And I, as a part of that, kind of always knew the difference, as it were, or always was sort of having those differences thrown at me. And it's not that it completely dominated my experience, but in the context of this conversation, it's what comes up first.
Yes. So you mentioned the town that you're from. How about your family, your religion, your outlook on life of the family culture?
Yeah. So I grew up in a Pentecostal family. Especially my extended family is quite religious. My immediate family, not so much so. We definitely went to church on Sundays, and, my older relatives are still fairly religious. It was a very there was a strictness about it, but my mother was sort of a little bit more rebellious, compared to her siblings. And so I felt like I did have some freedoms to choose. I started to rebel against that a bit in my teenage years, as many teenagers do, and began to look more into Eastern philosophy, but that wasn't a part of my family life. I grew up in a town that was, although it was quite divided racially, but I didn't feel a lot of overt racism as a child. Things, in retrospect, there of course are very clear instances, but I didn't grow up feeling unsafe or anything like this. A part of it was my interests. I, was in accelerated classes and I played classical instrument. And because of that, I think I was treated differently than the other Black kids, that I was around. And similarly in my adult life, as a classical musician, many of my colleagues, most of my colleagues were not Black. And so it put me in an interesting position, to kind of, to have not the normal Black experience, as it were, which is, as we now know, or as I now know, is a myth in and of itself.
Right. And you mentioned that you had this early interest in Eastern spirituality, and that was different from how you were raised. What form did that take initially, and where do you think that interest came from?
Well, I was somewhat of an outcast who hung out with other outcasts, and our, search for normalcy led us to mainly a lot of, Native American philosophies and Eastern philosophies, and where those things combined. I had some friends, for example, that were really into Carlos Castaneda and these ideas of universal oneness, whereas I was sort of a naturalist, and I guess I've always been sort of like a non-religious universalist, where just looking for connections, and started reading, some books of the Dalai Lama and Rapolo Wawula and Thich Nhat Hanh, and it made sense to me. I didn't embrace it as religion, and I still don't embrace religion in and of itself. But it definitely helped to solidify my ideas, or it gave me a language, through which I could see the world, that I could sort of codify my perspective.
So eventually, I assume that interest in spirituality led to some type of meditation practice. How did that manifest? What meditation practices or traditions did you find, and when was that?
Well, it was in my late 20s, really, that I started to meditate. I'm 47 now. And part of the thing that led me to the spiritual search in the first place was, of course, misery, and just this palpable, understanding of that I really felt that I could do nothing about. And, I believe that's what drove me to music. It drove me to, spiritual searching, and it also drove me to drugs. Or it was the driving force behind, what would be a very debilitating drug addiction that as I learned to address that, I went to a program that talked about loving God, serving others, but with God as an undefined, force. And that was it was, up to us to search for that. And, for me, I, sort of took some solace in some Buddhist writings and, started to teach myself, started to learn to meditate just based on what I had seen in books and trying to do whatever I thought that was. And eventually I found a Sangha to sit with in Saratoga, New York, that was, getting together each week and practicing guided meditations by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I made friends with some of those people. This was years into my sobriety. And I found it very helpful. However, it didn't quite, it didn't quite speak to me. It was a relief, but I still felt like it wasn't quite what I was looking for. I gained a lot from it. But so I continued to search, and a couple of friends at various times told me about the vipassana courses and Goenka's tradition. And I sat one of those courses about 12 or 13 years ago. And that was when my, meditative life kind of began. That was when my practice it was ignited in those first courses. And, so that was, what led me to what I'm doing today, which is, being very involved at a local center, a local meditation center. As I said before, I'm a musician, but also I am serving at Dhammadhara, the meditation center in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, as you know. And I feel like all of these, there are a lot of things that I keep saying drove me to meditation, but it really was how it felt, because I felt so lost before it. I felt actually quite displaced, even in my own community, my own racial community, but I also felt separate, from the white community. And so it sort of gave me a way to find some refuge within myself.
Right. So what changes did you start to see in yourself when you started up the meditation practice? What benefits or insights came in that first few years of your practice?
Well, I began to understand my responsibility in my own story. For some time, it was very blurred for me what I was causing and what was put upon me and how to deal with either of those, so-called realities. And meditation really has helped me to sort of parse those things out, and I've gained a lot of just acceptance of who I am in terms of, having a clearer starting point from which to work on myself, both on and off the meditation mat. It's given me just some relief from the constant torture that I put myself through, and the constant torture that I allow myself, or was allowing myself, I still do actually sometimes, quite a bit, that I allow myself to endure. That's just really quite needless.
Right. Yeah, definitely one of the main insights of taking up a meditation practice is the suffering that we're holding on to that we don't need to, and that it's just a question of letting that go, but how long it takes to realize that we can let something go that we didn't realize that we could. Yeah, so in terms of the intersection of race and Dhamma practice, which is one of the things we're looking at on this series in light of recent events, I'm curious what experiences you had with racism or prejudice prior to your meditation practice and your response or reaction or feeling with that. And then when the Dhamma practice started up and you became a very serious meditator, if you face such incidents again, and if your inner reaction or way of looking at it was affected in any way by the practice that you were undertaking.
Yes, well, I guess at some level, as I practice, it colors all of my experience. The racism I experienced before meditation is the same racism that I experienced after.
Right.
Sure. It's really, in my case, there were a few larger incidents where, things like being frequently stopped by the police, or people being suspicious of me, or, being a child in Georgia and someone just flat out, calling me names that I didn't need to be called as a 9-year-old. Things like this have always gone on. I always, I saw as a child, my parents grew up in they were born in the 30s, they grew up in the 40s, 50s, adults, 60s, 70s, all of these very, turbulent, difficult times for Black people in America. And I saw what it did to them even as a kid. And I would hear them talk sometimes. I think in general, they were loving people. And, I don't think that they were the most bigoted people in the world, but there was definitely a really strong resentment that they felt, having gone through Jim Crow, having been the grandchildren of slaves and the children of sharecroppers, working pretty hard to put me through a fancy education, so I could see how toxic those things were, for them. And I remember challenging their sentiments when I was a kid, saying, oh, we should be more loving and we shouldn't call each other names, very, as naive as possible, I mean, I think these things are true, but I was seeing it from such a naive perspective that I don't know how they even tolerated my little opinions at the time. But I saw that and I resolved that I wouldn't be that way. However, as all of this sort of aggression was taken out towards me, but really like some things directly, there's some incidents, I guess we could get into that if you want, but I don't know how important that is right now. Or just, this idea of me being told that there was a very low ceiling of what I could achieve in life, never seeing images of anyone that looked like me being successful, of walking into I remember in junior high school, walking into an honors math class with my best friend who was also Black, and in that class, and the teacher called us up to the front, to check our schedules because he was so certain that we were in the wrong room. He didn't check anyone else's schedules that day. Things like this, these kinds of people being suspicious, people, the constant discourtesy as I go out as a consumer. Like I said before, being stopped by the police quite regularly for doing nothing. Like all these things, I was trying not to allow it to toxify me, not to allow it to ruin my perspective. And I was sort of holding on to this naivete. But in the meanwhile, all these things were really bubbling up inside of me. I'm the kind of person that rather than lashes out, I tend to turn these things inward and self-destruct. And I saw what a weakened and defeated person it made me. And I feel like through meditation, I was able to see the difference, to get a little bit of objectivity, to understand what was happening to me. And a part of it was that I was denying to myself that I could feel, hatred, or that I could feel animosity towards another person. And by doing that, that was sort of my defense mechanism, that these things almost didn't exist. And so I was trying to preserve myself, but I wasn't really developing compassion. And ironically, I guess it would be ironic to some that through meditation, I learned that I too have hatred might be too strong a word, but that I do have ill will inside. And for one thing, it validated my feelings of, that I had been mistreated, but also it gives me compassion to know that, okay, these things are inside of all of us, that we all have our story, we all have our background, we have our things that we've learned, we have our reasons for doing things and for being the way that we are. And so it sort of gives me, it makes it a little bit easier to understand the villainy. I can't accept it, but the meditation and my practice takes the edge off of it, so that I don't have to walk around defeated, that I can, hold my head up, despite all that's going on and despite the way that, I'm treated or looked at or thought of.
Right. This is really interesting because you're talking about identifying and coming in touch with, through meditation, the existence of ill will inside you, which is really just a form of the experience of dukkha that, no one wants to face, and you're facing that presence of dukkha, and it's taking on this characteristic of ill will, coming from this unjust treatment, this consistently unfair and biased treatment throughout your life, that is this crushing presence. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like it's having this overbearing presence of this consistent pattern. And what I find interesting in this also is that you're identifying and articulating an experience that is a very common experience across America and its history, but especially prevalent in the conversation today, the existence of this pain, this ill will, this continued bias. And so the question I have for you that I'm really interested in is, now, as a Vipassana practitioner, you have certain tools for identifying this ill will and then working with it in some way. And when we look out in society and this ill will is identified, or this experience of dukkha is acknowledged, we see out in the world all the different ways that it's responded to, and often responded to out of pain or hurt. And as a Vipassana practitioner, I'm really interested in, as you began to identify the nature of this existence of dukkha, this toxic ill will that you're accepting and identifying inside, and now you have to work with it. Now you have to do something to observe it or to understand it. And so I'm wondering what shape your practice then took then. And I also invite you, if in my question or my summary I overreached in any way or didn't quite get it right, please do correct me. Otherwise, I'm interested in knowing about your experience of identifying and working with that ill will.
For me, I think it's just understanding that I'm not above it. And I feel like something that I would love to see these days is if more people took a look at that. I'm not a proponent of thinking anyone should be like me, because I wouldn't wish that upon them, but we all have our own stories. But for me, I think that maybe is the key. Like I said, I believe that people, they are at some level doing their best, or at the very least, they want to look like they're doing their best, to themselves and to others. And I feel like this deep dive inside, within this turbulence after so much external stillness that we've experienced in the past few months, this deep dive inside could be something that evokes real change. Like I've had so many friends come up to me very, very upset lately. And it's amazing to me how surprised people are, the prevalence and the regularity at which there's, manifestations of systemic racism. Almost as if they didn't realize that it was real. Like it was something that you read about from time to time, but they didn't realize that it was real. And I didn't realize that it's maybe coming from them too. I'm talking about loving, good-willed, good-hearted people, but we still have these biases, and we still, I think everyone has their biases, and I feel that, especially my white friends in particular have been coming up to me almost more upset than the Black people in my life in this particular time. My family and the Black people that I talk to, we're not we're very moved by what's going on, but it's the same thing that's been going on for our entire lives. And it's unbelievable to me that people are suddenly seeing this. What I fear is that we'll make rapid changes, that will make broad statements, that will take quick actions, that will sort of create exoneration of ourselves and our participation in ill will and in hatred, and then move on, as opposed to really looking inside and seeing where this is coming from, seeing where even a kind-hearted person might be benefiting from systemic racism, from holding others down, where, I'm sorry, I'm having a difficult time expressing this.
Yeah, take your time.
It's very painful to understand when you understand that you're hurting another person. And I feel that in general, when tensions flare, good people might respond, but maybe stop short of delving into the depths of that pain. And that's what I think we need to do in order to turn things around. It's really easy for pain to just turn into anger. You know, many of my Black friends and family are very angry. It's also very easy for that pain to turn into pity, which is what I feel like I'm getting from many of my white friends, where they're I'm so sorry. A man stopped me in the parking lot of a supermarket that I'd never met before, you know, to apologize to me. And I believe that he thought he was doing a good thing. And maybe that's a start. But I didn't feel that. I don't think he was really talking to me at all. You know, it felt more like it was just a search for exonerating, for separating, distancing ourselves from the problem, you know, signaling that, you know, I have these virtues, signaling that one has these virtues, as opposed to really looking at, you know, how we are implicit in the system.
Right. And that's painful. That's an experience of dukkha, whatever side you're on. That's an experience of coming to face with the suffering within. And it's interesting what you say. You mentioned on your side of Black friends leaning in towards anger and on your white friends leaning in towards pity. And I wonder if both these reactions are in some way different sides of the coin that are obfuscating the experience of just feeling and investigating the dukkha within of either side.
I think for sure. And I think that's why we remain as static as we do, because it's just too difficult. The conversation's too hard. And I think that, you know, people want to figure out how they can feel better as opposed to really being better.
Right. And meditation, as you well know, is not about feeling better. It's about coming to face with the truth within, which I think when you come out the other side does feel better. But as Sayadaw U Tejaniya in Burma likes to say, as his yogis investigate more and more the reality within and find it disconcerting and unpleasant and disappointing in their mind, he laughs, and one of his catchphrases is, "There's no good news." You know, as you look inside, there's no good news. Trust me, it doesn't get any better, you know, and that's kind of a paradoxical thing for those who've never taken a step on the path. Those who've gone just a little bit understand that experience of dukkha. But towards those ends, what role do you see Dhamma practice, meditation practice, the Buddhist teachings playing some kind of role, some kind of positive role in this discussion or awareness that can inform or shape the present moment going forward?
That we all suffer. And that for me, my practice, a very large part of my practice has to do with serving. And I feel that, you know, if I serve people and they can come to their own understandings whenever and, you know, whatever those are, you know, through practicing, then I feel that I've done the right thing, as it were. I think that if we have that meditation and you know, Dhamma practice gives us the tools and the courage to look within, and it gives us the courage and the tools to look within in an objective way, which makes it slightly more bearable when the sit is over. During it, as you said, there's no good news. I remember, actually, I think I experienced my first real violent thoughts during a meditation retreat, which I was, you know, kind of surprised and relieved to know I was a human being. But, you know, these things are inside. And so I think if we can come to grips with that, then we have a real place from which we can work. As long as we're sort of, you know, beholden to our own sense of beauty and our own sense of, you know, who we want to seem like, then it's really hard to do any real work, because we're starting from a place of falsehood. And in meditation, we find that, you know, that falsehood sort of is, you know, is the predominant thing in which we live. But it chips away at it. It chips away at it. And, I think also there's just a basic part of the teachings is just, understanding, compassion and being able to be empathetic with each other and, turning that empathy into compassion and being able to serve people in an impersonal way. So it's not about taking credit and it's not about getting anything in return and not even about getting results, just doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do sometimes. I think that would go a long way. And on the one hand, as I hear myself say it, I feel like some of that naivete that I fought so hard to maintain is coming right out. But it is what I think is true, though.
Well, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you expressed as a child might have been a naivete of the world you want to live in, but what you're expressing now is coming from a place of hard-fought spiritual practice to get to a place where you're identifying the experience of dukkha and the toxicity and the pain inside and not hiding from it, facing it as best you can, while also making a choice to respond with empathy and service.
Right. It's just understanding that you can't hurt someone else without hurting yourself, and to see where, if you're deciding to hate someone for any reason, you have to create so much destruction inside to be able to do that. You have to maintain destructive stories in order to do that. And this is where I think the meditation helps me and would help anyone, to come out of this. The Dhamma is no different for a Black person or a white person. It's just helps us get in touch with, who we are as humans in this moment, and clearly there's enough stuff going on outside, it's coming from somewhere, and it always comes from inside. And I feel as though, like I said, we're so eager to remove ourselves from being a part of the problem. But if we look inside, we can easily see that, we very much are, involved in problems.
Right. And as a meditator, having been a serious meditator for many years now and maintaining a practice and the Shila and everything else, when you're now faced in situations of apparent or overt racism or discrimination or something else, what is the internal process of using those meditative tools to respond to it? How has that been different than your experience before?
I don't get as angry. I don't get as sad, but I, do feel it necessary to take some actions and to talk about it. Once I was busking, I was playing in the New York City subways, and a man came up to me, and the look in his eyes showed that he and I were not in the same reality. And I'm sitting there playing Bach, and he comes up and he slaps me.
Oh.
And the people in the subway were like, we should get him, Some people wanted to go after him. Other people that saw it started immediately giving me bigger tips. And what I did was I continued playing Bach. And I feel like as a meditator, I've learned better how not to, personalize the hatred that I see coming towards me. I learned I sort of understand that, that I'm seeing a different reality than this person, that they are on their own trip, as it were, and that I don't have to fall victim to it. I don't have to inherit their story.
Right.
I don't have to be a part of who they are. And, I really have my practice to thank for that.
Right. And that's easier said than done. And it's, it makes me think that it's not even so much what you're doing, but how you're doing it, because you're responding with mindfulness and insight and compassion and strength of your own series of choices. It reminds me of the story that Goenka tells of someone giving you a gift you don't want to accept and just choosing not to accept it. At the same time, that response could also be done out of weakness or out of fear or out of out of some other negativity, but not in this case. As I hear that story, it seems not so much a question of what you're doing, but how you're doing it and the mind state and how you're choosing to respond to that. And some other meditator could have responded in a completely different way, but with the same sense of non-harm and mindfulness and other things. So it's not like there's one formula to bring to bear, but it's the mindfulness that you bring to the moment and what can be very difficult moments sometimes.
Yes, I think without that, then I would be defeated on a daily basis by all this. You know, some days are better than others. And it's tiring sometimes. It's exhausting to just, you know, have so many tiny things over the course of a day or a week or a month, you know, add up where someone, you know, has treated me clearly in a different way because, and clearly I'm Black. And it's not even always out of malice. Sometimes it's just out of just not knowing what else to do. You know, I live in a rural area. There are not a lot of Black people here. And so just sort of inspiring discomfort in people based on nothing I've done. And sometimes it's worse than that. You know, that's really giving the benefit of the doubt to others. But it is exhausting. But at the same time, you know, there's only so much energy that I have, right? And as much as possible, you know, I don't want to allow myself to be victimized. I've been fortunate, you know, that I haven't been in a situation that was so severe that it, you know, completely changed the direction of my life. You know, I've never been attacked or anything like this. You know, I mean, I have had, you know, some things happen. Like when I was 19, I was pulled over at a traffic stop and I had a small firecracker in my car and I got a ticket for it and didn't think about it again until 2014 when I applied for a job. They did a FBI check and it showed that I had an explosive weapons charge.
Oh, no.
For a single firecracker. Yeah. So, you know, there are things like that where maybe people were a little bit more out to get me than I realized at the time. But in general, you know, I've tried to live in a way that surrounds me with kind people. And my immediate circle, I've been very fortunate to have that experience from people of, you know, many races, many cultures, I should say at least. But leaving that bubble, you know, there's a bit of tension that goes with it in this country and in every country I've been to. And I don't know, you can fall prey to it and have it, you know, erode your moral compass. Or some people are more activist. For me, I'm more pacifist and try to, you know, interact kindly with people one at a time and hoping that, you know, makes some change. You know, I try to look inside and keep things impersonal at that level when it comes to these things. It's not always so easy. You know, these past few months have been very difficult. You know, just bringing so much to light. Just, you know, sometimes it is, you know, ignorance is bliss sometimes, right? And I definitely do spend some time in life ignoring these things. But more and more as I get older, I feel more able to act against it without being, you know, damagingly reactive.
Right. And do you feel that it's your meditation practice that's helping you inform that kind of response, or just normal maturation or growth? Or where would you say that's come from?
Oh, I think it's absolutely my meditation practice. Maturation doesn't force us in any particular direction.
Right.
So I feel that definitely it's my practice in looking inside and, you know, understanding the mental processes that are inspired by stimulus that comes from outside of me, you know, as coldly as that, and, you know, going about my business with that understanding. I don't have time to analyze every one of these little reactions or every one of these little interactions. So I think using my practice as a whole helps me get through it all.
Right. And on that subject of practice, with the impetus of recent events, many people, as well as social and cultural institutions, have been starting this month to seriously examine themselves for implicit bias and whether, even unwittingly, they might be contributing to the perpetuation of social inequities. Many people are coming to realize that however much we think we know, we all need to become better educated and empathetic about race and injustice. So one such institution that might require more scrutiny is the Vipassana movement and mindfulness movement. And you had spoken about that, your own inner practice being a refuge to you, but the overall movement does lack people of color and teachers of color. And it was largely formed by white hippies, you could say, that found the Dhamma in India and brought it back, and however unwittingly might have perpetuated certain kind of unexamined assumptions about how the teachings were to be disseminated. And I wonder, when you close your eyes, the practice is definitely internal and it's your own work and your own instructions that are doing that work. But when you open your eyes and you're in the community that you're in and receiving the teachings that you're receiving, I wonder what that experience has been like. Have you found it welcoming and conducive for non-white audiences, or do you think that there's room to grow in that area?
At one point, I guess this could have been said of white people as well, right? Maybe in the 50s, they would say, well, there are not a lot of white people practicing Dhamma. So, is that an inequity? And so I think it spreads as it spreads. And I don't find that to be the fact that there are not a lot of Black people involved in insight meditation, I don't find that to be an inequity. I think that people and cultures come to things as they do and as they need to, as long as they're welcomed if they try to, and definitely, at the center where I am, and I mean, maybe this might be a vast assumption, but I would assume at any, Dhamma center where they're really practicing, that anyone would be allowed to come there. So a part of me cringes at the sentiment that the Dhamma needs to be handed to this group of people or that group of people, or else they wouldn't be able to get it. Because doesn't sound natural. It sort of separates one group of humans from another in a way that doesn't really have a lot of basis.
Right.
I know at one point there was some talk in our tradition of there was actually a course for the African diaspora that took place in India, but there was some talk of doing that in the States. And I think it's well intended, but at the same time, I think it's really maybe born out of bias and perhaps born out of some guilt. I feel like for me, my role in that is I've started meditating, and so now my sister has come to sit a course, and I can talk to my nephew about it, and I have a cousin that's interested in coming, and I had a friend that was going to come sit a course, and passing it through my community that way. And also just by, if people see the change in you, then they become interested in it. Some people, people who are attracted to those types of changes. And so I think that it will eventually spread through the Black community the way it spread through communities in Asia, and the way that it spread through, the hippie movement, and the way that it spread through what's mainly sort of, it seems like a upper middle class white communities in the States. It's still a bit remote for people here, being able to take off days at a time to meditate is not a luxury that everyone has. So I think that in the Black community, there are some economic barriers. There are also some religious barriers as well, because there's still quite a very strong, Christian rule in the Black community. But I don't see it as particularly problematic, but I see it as just kind of where we are right now. And it's sort of as if, we're not beggars,
Right.
So it's not that you have to hand something to someone because you think it's good for them. I think that if more people use whatever their spiritual practice is, that's what helps. It's not about getting other people to do what I'm doing necessarily.
Right. So do you think that there could be a call for more outreach to go to unrepresented communities and look at how to reach some of those peoples in community better? Or are you more of the opinion that these things are just going to have an organic spread and Dhamma is just going to move as Dhamma is going to move and it'll just happen naturally?
Well, again, I disagree with even the term of community being underrepresented. You know, I mean, we all have our own culture. So I don't think that's a real situation in my mind. Maybe if you're talking about medical care or education or employment opportunities, then you can look to underserved communities in those areas. But when it comes to a spiritual practice, I think that it's important that things grow organically and naturally, and that we sort of understand that people find things spiritually speaking. I think that people will find things if they're looking, they'll find it as they need it. You know, I know many people from all kinds of faiths that practice the tenets that we talk about in Dhamma without having ever meditated for a minute. And I know many people who meditate, and I know myself who has meditated and has fallen short of those ideals. So I think it's important not to codify righteousness too much, but that we are just sincere in our own practices. And so I would love to see more Black people meditating, and it thrills me to no end when I see Black people coming to the center, which is more now than there used to be. But I don't feel the need to make it happen faster in the Black community.
Right. So one question on the current protests that are happening. So some detractors have criticized some of the violence and the looting that's taken place during these protests, even though others have pointed out that these could have been caused by agents or provocateurs. But in any case, some commentators have also defended that even if this is taking place and it's not ideal, it might be the only way to really bring about the much needed attention necessary for change in this country. As a meditator who understands the role of Shila and Dhamma practice, where do you stand on this issue?
I don't think that violence is the answer in any case. I don't think that violence is a good answer in any case. I understand that it happens and sometimes it has to happen in order to, make for a change. But I think in the long run, it's not an effective way to make change in a movement of racial equality. I think that it helps people who already were looking down, helps them to prove their own points. Mm-hmm. I'm so skeptical of anything that I see. I know that for sure there was looting, and I know that for sure there were protests, but so much of the coverage of all these events is just done in a way that's, just commercially beneficial, So it's sort of, I feel that whatever the media can do to divide us, helps the media to exist. And so, I think that we hear about it so much because of that. But yeah, I absolutely think that it's wrong. I get the sentiment. I've seen some people interviewed where they expressed why they might loot in their own places, and just as a desperate reaction to just being stepped on for generations. Mm-hmm. So I can understand that, I can't emotionally identify with it so much because that's just not a part of my day to day, but I can see where it's inside of me, and so mm-hmm. I can understand where it's coming from, but I think it's wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong. Again, I think it just sort of exacerbates the problem, and it adds another problem. It's just, inflaming things.
Right. Well, that's all I have here. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or any other observations that weren't covered by the questions?
I don't think so. Thank you for, of course, it's your discretion to do what you like with this interview, but I appreciate talking to you about it, and that you're, appreciate, the sentiment of getting this out there. And something I wanted to do during, in talking was to just avoid the grand statement. Mm-hmm. Whenever it comes to a platitude, the truth is just lost. Mm. It's sort of it's like the indirect enemy of introspection, you know?
Right.
But I do thank you for having me on and for taking the time to have this conversation. And yeah, thank you. I wish you all the best.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for this and for your time. I thank you for your honesty and vulnerability, and I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for checking out this episode of the Insight Myanmar Podcast. We hope that you are enjoying this special podcast series exploring the intersection between race, social justice, and Dhamma practice. This show brought you the voices of some meditators of color who reflect on their experiences with both implicit and explicit bias in the mindfulness movement, as well as the society's systematic racism, the present social protest movement, and the importance of a Dhamma practice when facing these issues. We hope this content provides insight, interest, and inspiration. Regular listeners to our podcast may know that our usual episodes feature sit-down interviews with a single guest, but we felt the current moment was so important that we wanted to diverge from our usual content to bring you this current series. However, in diverting our limited donation funds for these episodes, it has put a strain on our finances going forward. We know this is a difficult time for many, and that there is an added financial strain as well. That being said, we appreciate any amount of generosity you are able to give to keep our engine going. While all of our podcast contributors are meditators, who are either volunteering their time in full or providing substantial discounts, there is still a baseline financial need to cover overall expenses. Whatever funds we are able to collect now will be used solely for producing these new episodes. Any additional donations will allow us to increase our run. With that, thank you for your support, stay safe, and be well. We welcome your contribution in any amount, denomination, and transfer method. You may give via Patreon at patreon.com/insightmyanmar, via PayPal at paypal.me/insightmyanmar, or by credit card by going to insightmyanmar.org/donation. In all cases, that's Insight Myanmar, one word, INSIGHTMYANMAR.org. You have been listening to the Insight Myanmar podcast. We would appreciate it very much if you would be willing to rate, review, and or share this podcast. Every little bit of feedback helps. If you are interested, you can subscribe to the Insight Myanmar podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please check out our website for a list of our complete episodes, including additional text, videos, and other information available at www.insightmyanmar.org. If you cannot find our feed on your podcast player, please let us know and we will ensure it can be offered there. There was certainly a lot to talk about in this episode, and we'd like to encourage listeners to keep the discussion going. You can make a post, suggest a guest, request specific questions, and join in on discussions on our Insight Myanmar Podcast Facebook group. You are also most welcome to follow our Facebook and Instagram accounts by the same name. If you're not on Facebook, you can also message us directly at burmadhamma@gmail.com. That's one word, burmadhamma@gmail.com. Or if you'd like to start up a discussion group on another platform, let us know and we can share that forum here. We would also like to take this time to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, especially our two sound engineers, Martin Combs and Tharng A. There's of course Zach Hessler, content collaborator and part-time co-host. Ken Pransky helps with editing, Dragos Bandita and Andre Francois make our sketches, GPU does our Burmese translation, Herman Perez, Santiago Hedar, and Marisol do our Spanish translations, and a special Mongolian volunteer who was asked to remain anonymous does our social media templates. We'd also like to thank everyone who assisted us in arranging for the guests we have interviewed so far. And of course, we send a big thank you to the guests themselves for agreeing to come and share such powerful personal stories. Finally, we're immensely grateful for the donors who made this entire thing possible in the first place. We also remind our listeners that the opinions expressed by our guests are their own and not necessarily reflective of the host or other podcast contributors. Also, this recording is the exclusive right of Insight Myanmar Podcast. It is meant for personal listening only and cannot be used without the express written permission of the podcast owner. This includes any video, audio, written transcript, or excerpt of any episode. That said, we are open for collaboration, so if you have a particular idea in mind for sharing any of our podcasts or podcast-related information, please feel free to contact us with your proposal. Finally, we welcome your contribution in any amount, denomination, or transfer method. You may give via Patreon at www.patreon.com/insightmyanmar, via PayPal at www.paypal.me/insightmyanmar, or by credit card by going to www.insightmyanmar.org/donation. In all cases, that's Insight Myanmar, one word, INSIGHTMYANMAR. If you'd like to give especially to support our new run of coronavirus episodes, please go to the GoFundMe site and search for Insight Myanmar to find our campaign there. If you are in Myanmar and would like to give a cash donation, please feel free to get in touch with us. With that, thank you for listening, and we welcome back next show.